Welcome to Mental Health and Faith, a closer look. I'm Carolyn Cooper, and my ministry name is Mental Health Connect. My mission is to offer encouragement and to help you find your way into this complicated world. The episodes will feature guests such as authors, pastors, mental health professionals, and many other individuals who have something to contribute to this conversation. I also will post what I consider to be teaching episodes, where we dig into scripture or we dig into a topic related to our Christian walk and our mental health and wellness. There will be links and resources in the show notes. You'll want to check those out. Now sit back and enjoy the show. Hi, this is Carolyn Cooper, here with my colleague, Jane Alexander. We are excited today to have our guest, Roxanne Pendleton. She's going to be sharing a little about trauma today.
Thank you for having me here today. I'm very honored to get to talk with you both and to talk about this particular topic.
Roxanne, can you tell us a little about yourself before we get started?
Sure. So I work at Truman Medical Centers in Behavioral Health in the Center for Trauma-Informed Innovation. And that's a big, long title. And what that means is I work as a consultant to help people understand the impact of trauma on the brain, on our bodies, and on our behaviors, as well as trauma-informed or trauma-sensitive ways that we as individuals and organizations and communities can respond to those who have trauma, which, by the way, is all of us.
Interesting.
We call it trauma-informed care, but more and more I'm thinking it should be called human-informed care because we all have brains that function in similar ways. But we teach people trauma-informed best practices. And what that means is, how do you respond to those who have trauma in ways that create a compassionate, healing environment? And how do you respond to trauma in yourself so that you can heal?
Can you give us a definition of trauma?
Trauma refers to intense experiences that overwhelm our ability to cope. So traumatization occurs when our internal resources and our external resources just aren't adequate to navigate an external threat. And that threat can be a real threat to our health and safety or a perceived threat to our health and safety. And when I say safety, I don't mean just physical. I mean psychological, emotional, social, relational safety as well.
Roxanne, you mentioned external and internal resources.
Yes.
Can you explain a little about that?
Absolutely. So when a crisis occurs or a difficult situation or any kind of significant stress, we all have ways that we cope. And internal resources are those things that literally live inside our skin. So that could be our intelligence, our creativity, our hope, our faith, our optimism, our ability to solve problems, all those things that keep us strong in tough times that are within us.
Okay.
External resources are just the opposite. It's those things that we have around us that support our strength and well-being. And they can be basic things like food, clothing, shelter, education, access to medical care. And they can be things more commonly when you think of external resources. You think of your family, your friends, perhaps your faith community, those things outside you that help you navigate stressful situations. And both are important and they reinforce one another. For example, you might be very optimistic as a person and you might have a lot of faith that you can get through anything. And then you might lose your job, lose your house, and get sick. And suddenly your sense of optimism and hope could be impacted. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Absolutely.
So trauma occurs when I don't have adequate internal and or external resources to deal with a current threat. And that explains why trauma is so personalized. You and I might go through the same experience, and you might come out feeling fine, and I might come out completely devastated. And you've probably seen that in your life. People who go through something like a divorce or an illness, some of them seem to do okay. And I would say those are people who have internal and external resources that help them cope. And then some of them really don't do as well. And they might be lacking those external and internal resources.
So you talked about how individual it can be for trauma.
Yes.
One person can experience the same thing as another person, but react or respond in a totally different way.
Absolutely. Very differently. And that is impacted by a number of things. It's impacted by not just things like our basic personality, but what has happened to us before. What other kinds of traumas have we lived through? Are our brains kind of honed to be hypervigilant because of our past trauma? Or did we have situations where we felt pretty much calm and nurtured and supported, and so when this current trauma happens, we just kind of move through it with a relative amount of ease. Not just our personality is different, but all those things that have shaped our life experiences up to that moment, which is why it's really difficult to predict whether an experience is going to be traumatizing for a person. We don't know all their internal and external resources. We don't know everything that happened to them. We often make judgments based on the way they behave. So when someone is behaving in an undesirable way, we might think, I wonder what is wrong with that person? What is wrong with that person? But a trauma-informed way to observe that behavior would be to ask yourself, I wonder what happened to that person? Because what happens to us literally shapes our brains and the way our brains function, and that determines our behavior. So removing judgment's a big part of this, and trying to understand what's pushing behavior, what's driving behavior, versus just assuming we know because we might not respond that same way.
Right. I wonder if you could give us some examples, some kind of concrete examples of situations that might cause trauma.
Absolutely. And I think there's some big traumas, like trauma with a capital T, that we would all recognize. A natural disaster can be very traumatic for people. A near-death experience can be very traumatic. War is very traumatic. Poverty is very traumatic. Not being able to get your basic needs met with any kind of consistency is very traumatizing. So those might be traumas with a capital T. But there are lots of traumas with a lowercase t, if you will. Anytime, again, that our resources are overwhelmed. So for some people, well, I would say probably for many people, losing a job can be very traumatic. Now, you've probably known someone who just kept on rolling, had a plan and had a good job the next week. But for many of us, that's a trauma. And that might overwhelm us because it might impact our sense of identity and our sense of agency and our sense of value. So that can be traumatizing. Again, any experience that overwhelms your ability to cope. So think for a minute with me about children. Their brains are still developing. And we know for children to have healthy brains, they need stability, consistency of care, they need nutrition. There are certain things they need: connection and loving touch, and anything that interrupts that can be traumatic for a child. So of course, any kind of neglect, any kind of abuse, but also something like living in a home where someone struggles with substance use disorder or substance misuse, living in a home with a parent who has a mental illness, living in a home where there's divorce, which is really common. But that can be a trauma, depending on what resources the child and or the parents have to navigate that. So again, it's very individualized. Do I have the resources to overcome or move through this? It may not be a trauma for me. It might just be a bad experience. But for someone else, it could really cause trauma. And the lingering impacts of trauma are played out in our behavior because, again, we become hypervigilant. And what I mean by that is our brains become constantly looking for the next threat. What's going to come at me next? And so I'm always amped up and I'm never quite relaxed, and I might overreact because of my history of trauma. I might snap pretty quickly to some behaviors and judgments that you might not think are needed in that situation. But remember, we have my whole history that's informing and really impacting my behavior. So research shows us that when children experience trauma, it really does impact the way their brains develop. And the areas of our brains that are used most get bigger and stronger. The areas that aren't used as much get smaller. And so a child who's had a trauma response, or especially ongoing trauma, the part of their brain in the brainstem and the limbic system that reacts to save their lives, the brainstem, that kind of stress response, the fight, flight, or freeze stress response that we talk about, that gets strong, and the pathways there get really strong. Whereas the front part of their brain, the prefrontal cortex that's involved in learning and growing and thinking about consequences of your actions and being able to regulate emotion, if if that's not used as much, then it's not as strong. And so we might see a child who is very prone to react in a powerful way, or withdraw and isolate or freeze, because that's what the brain is used to doing. It doesn't mean it can't be changed.
Right.
And that's I think that's the hope in trauma-informed care, because we can intervene at any point in the lifespan of someone who's had trauma, and we can provide an environment of trauma-sensitive behaviors and practices that can help that brain return to a calm state. And therefore, that person has a better chance of learning and growing and healing. And I should probably say, what are those things we could do? Is that going to be your next question?
Actually, you just read my mind.
I was
going to say, what are some tips you have?
Yeah, so the first thing I want to point out are the main principles of trauma-informed care.
Okay.
So trauma-informed care understands that for a person to succeed, to heal, to move forward, to grow in their life, to thrive, their brain has to be in a calm state. We were designed to live in what is known as the parasympathetic nervous system, which is, it's also called rest and digest. So there's fight, flight, or freeze, which is the sympathetic nervous system. That's our stress response. And then there's rest and digest, which is the parasympathetic nervous system. And that's where we're designed to live, where we're calm and engaged, healthy, happy. We can form relationships, we can make good decisions, we can digest our food, we can do all the things we need to do. The stress response was developed really to save our lives. So it's a short-term response. I'm walking through the forest, I see a bear, I'm going to have a lot of things happen really quickly, internally, physiologically, that are designed to keep me alive. And that response was designed to last 30 to 45 minutes, maybe an hour. Because after an hour, I've escaped the bear. Or I'm inside the bear.
Right.
And,
I was going to say, my response would be run.
Right. So it's supposed to then shift back into kind of our normal, calm way of being. The problem with our modern society is we're often very stressed. A lot of things are coming at us and triggering that stress response. And then if we have trauma, our brains are already primed to be in our stress response. So you can kind of see how it layers upon itself. Right. So what a traumatized brain needs is first and foremost to feel safe. Safety is the core principle of trauma-informed care. It is the number one thing we look at. How can I help this person feel safe? Because remember, we go into our stress response when we feel threatened, and that can be physical or emotional. So if you're working with someone who's been traumatized, or yourself in the midst of your own trauma, one question to ask is, how can I help this person feel safe? And that's not just our physical environment. That's all the different things that we do to help people feel like they're not going to be attacked by a bear. Right. And so that's about our physical environment, but also how do I make myself a safe space? Right. How do I keep myself calm? And so that's the first question, safety. What can I do to help this person feel safe? The second principle of trauma-informed care is trustworthiness. And trustworthiness is about doing what you say you're going to do, being transparent, explaining things, building a relationship where that person knows you're not going to hurt them, they know you have their best. Also refraining from judgment, which is good for two reasons. One, when we judge people, they know, like they feel it, and they get defensive. Right. But if I were to ask you, what's the most basic judgment we teach our kids? We say stranger,
danger.
Danger, correct.
Yes.
The most basic judgment is that person going to hurt me? So every time my brain judges anything, we get a little hit of our stress response because it travels the pathways, right? So many world religions, and I know certainly the Christianity, which is the one that I practice, we are warned not to judge. Well, there's a neurophysiological reason for that. It makes our brain stressed. Right. Yeah. So trustworthiness, you build that relationship, you're transparent, you take responsibility for your actions, you stay out of judgment, and then you give people choices, which is the third principle of trauma-informed care, giving people choice. Trauma, by its very nature, removes our choice from us. Something comes in and impacts our world without our permission. And so giving someone a choice, even a tiny choice, where do you want to sit? In the hospital where I work, it might be a nurse saying, do you want to have the shot in your arm or your hip? Right? Just tiny little choices. So you could ask yourself, what choices can I offer this person? And then collaborate with them, giving them a voice, giving them a choice, and then asking them, what is it that they think they need? One of the things we say in trauma-informed care is no decision about me without me.
Is that related at all to a person needing a sense of control in their lives?
Absolutely. Yes, you nailed it. So control is one of our basic needs.
Okay.
And trauma takes control away, which makes us feel unsafe. And so when I give someone a choice, when I give someone a voice, when I ask them to collaborate with me, because really, you're the expert on you.
Mm-hmm.
I might have, say I'm a doctor, I might have training in medicine and human physiology, but who's the expert on your life?
Right.
It's you. And your motivations and your behaviors and your habits and your goals and dreams. And so the most successful healing occurs when people are collaborating, right? Mm-hmm. So collaboration is the fourth principle of trauma-informed care. We've got safety, trustworthiness, choice, voice, and collaboration. And then the final one is empowerment. So what can I do to help this person take their power back, give them some control, and celebrate their strengths versus focusing on their weaknesses? Many of us with mental illness, myself included, have gone through life for some time thinking that that's our burden.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Right. Really, it's also the source of our strength. I mean, I wouldn't be who I am today without my mental illness.
Amen.
Right?
I'm the same way. I would not be where I am today if I hadn't had to move through that journey.
Right. So the other huge aspect of trauma-informed care, and the one that really excites me, is the focus on resilience. Mm-hmm. All of those principles are moving with the intention of helping people be resilient. And humans are very resilient, and we can heal, and we do heal. And so all of those principles are practiced in a framework of humility, kind of gender, cultural, historical humility. I can't know what it's like to be you. That's why it's important for us to collaborate. Mm-hmm. And also the sense that we are resilient and we can nurture and foster resilience.
So for someone who doesn't really understand what it means to be resilient, can you give a description of that? And before you do, I think I'll share quickly that I heard, I don't know how many people remember this Bozo toy where it had a weight in the bottom. You could push it and it bounces back.
Yes.
And I just heard that recently that could be one definition of resilience is you're knocked down, but you bounce back.
I like it. Did you have a Bozo?
I didn't have a Bozo, but I certainly remember them. And I remember, if you and I are thinking of the same thing, Carolyn, it was, he called it a ballast.
Oh, yeah.
Or a ballast.
Yeah.
In the bottom of the clown to keep it from tipping over, from falling over, because it would always bounce back.
Yes, so that's a good metaphor. For me, it was Weebles. Do you remember Weebles wobble, but they don't fall down? Yes. It was the same kind of idea. Mm-hmm. And yes, having that weight or those things that I would say ground us, keep us connected and centered, so that when crises come, we might wobble. We may even fall down for a while, and one of our fellow Weebles can come up and kind of help push us back upright. But yeah, so resilience can be internal, and it certainly is helped with the external supports that we have.
Very good.
So I would define resilience as the capacity to navigate and cope with stressors and grow stronger through that stress. So that I think resilience creates an upward spiral. We're familiar with the downward spiral when things get worse and worse. I like to look at resilience as, I came through something and I learned, and the next time life circles back around and another hard thing happens, then I had more tools, I had more internal resources, I had more external resources, I had plans, I had practices, and I got out of it faster. I didn't stay down as long. And then the next time life circles around, there's another crisis, then I recognized it sooner. I gave myself the support or pulled to myself the support I needed sooner. I like to say that strong people are not people who never need help. Rather, they are people who are experts at pulling in the help they need when they need it. We have this myth that strong people never need help. And I think the opposite is true. I think strong people are really great at pulling in the help they need as they need it. And therefore they overcome.
Right. Jane has a question, and
Yes, I do. Roxanne, was there ever any kind of an event that took place in your life, or events that caused you to become interested in doing the work that you do, your career?
Yeah, that's a great question, and definitely. I think it was several events. First of all, I have my own lived experience of severe mental illness, suicidal depression, debilitating anxiety, and PTSD. In fact, in the year 2000, I was hospitalized 4 different times for trying to take my own life. And as I healed, which is, mental illness heals, I want to say that. We all know that, right?
Yes.
Depression and anxiety and PTSD, there are pathways of healing. And as that healed, I became more aware of people around me who were struggling. And at that time, I was working as a pastor. And more I became aware not only of mental illness among those that I served, but stress-related disorders that I was seeing in those among my congregation and in the community who were those who were caregivers. And so I became deeply concerned with, how can we alleviate stigma? Because one of the things is people are afraid to ask for help, or they have been afraid of being judged or even losing their jobs if they ask for help. And how can we support our caregivers? And I ended up starting in 2008 doing some fundraising for Mental Health America. And at that event, I shared a little of my own story publicly. People kept saying, do you have something I can take with me? Do you have a book? Do you have something that I can share with a friend? And so in response to that, I wrote a book called Laughing Again. And it's my experience of healing from suicidal depression and the lifestyle practices that I use to keep my brain healthy. So I feel like the work I get to do today pulls into it my own experiences. I have a master's degree in pastoral care and counseling. It brings that. It brings my passion for advocacy. And I get to use even all the bad things, the things I succeeded at and the things where I terribly failed, to learn more about how trauma impacts the brain, how it impacts us as people, and not just physically and emotionally, but also relationally. And I would say there's a spiritual aspect to it as well.
Roxanne, I do sincerely thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to come and share with us. And I know that our listeners will really have learned a lot from this today. So thank you.
Thank you for having me.
I hope you enjoyed today's episode. And don't forget, there's even more information in the show notes. You'll want to check those out. Now, please join the conversation on mental health and faith. Leave your comments or send me an email with your thoughts, questions, or suggestions. I really look forward to hearing from you. May God bless your journey.